Hello and welcome back to Pixel's Book Club. It's been quite a while since we've done one of these, but this is a bit of a special episode because today we're pretty much exclusively going to be talking about all of the manga that I've been collecting over the past few months. As you can see from these two massive piles of books here, this is probably going to take us quite a while to get through. So let's just crack on with it and talk about the first book of today's video, which is Zom 100. So Zom 100, there's quite a few volumes of this now. I've only got the first one, and to be honest, I've not really felt much of an urge to go out and get the others, because although I did enjoy this, it isn't my favourite. The premise is pretty interesting though, because it's set in a zombie apocalypse where this person who hates his job sort of finds a second life and actually enjoys the zombie apocalypse. So it's probably more light-hearted and funny than most other books in this genre. There's quite a few darkly funny moments in this, but obviously with it being a zombie apocalypse thing, it is also a little bit dark and it is quite gory and violent as well. And another thing with this is that the artwork is actually really good. It kind of blends this more realistic style with a more cartoony manga style, and I think that works really well with the blending of the dark elements and then the light-hearted comedy elements. It's pretty good. So the next one I'm talking about is kind of similar to Zom 100 in the way that I've only got one volume of it, and in the way that I'm not all that interested in carrying on with this series, at least for the time being. And it is Dorohedoro. So the reason that I'm not all too interested in this one is because it's a little bit too fantastical for my tastes. So it's basically about this guy who's turned into a half-human, half-lizard by basically a group of wizards or magicians, I guess. And it's about this lizard person trying to get his old body back. So yeah, it's pretty out there with its story, and it's probably a little bit too out there for me. It's another one that's quite violent, but this one, again, kind of mixes comedy elements in there as well. So although it is quite dark, it's not unbelievably dark, so much so that it's depressing or anything. It balances that quite nicely. The artwork in this one is almost kind of more sketchy, and it mixes in these coloured pages as well, which is actually quite rare in manga from what I've read anyway. So yeah, it is good for the art, but the story isn't quite for me. There's a little bit of a theme going on with the books that we're talking about at the moment, because this next one is another one where I've only got the first volume. But unlike the others we've talked about, this one is a lot more light-hearted and doesn't feature any darker or more violent elements or anything. And it is Rent a Girlfriend. So the gist with this one is that there's this guy who's in college and he's recently broken up with his girlfriend. And in order to sort of get back at her and make her feel a bit jealous, he uses this Rent a Girlfriend service, but as the story goes on, things sort of get more and more out of control, and his life and the Rent a Girlfriend's life get more interconnected. So there's one moment really early on where they end up having to go to hospital, and they meet his grandma who's in the hospital. But they're obviously thinking that this Rent a Girlfriend is his actual girlfriend. So stuff like that keeps happening and they have to keep meeting up together, and it just becomes really awkward. So yeah, if that sounds appealing to you, it's a pretty good read and it is quite funny too. So these next ones that I'm talking about, we're finally talking about a series where I've got more than the first volume, and this is probably one of the series that I've been enjoying most. Similarly to Rent a Girlfriend, this is a much more light-hearted one, and it's also a comedy as well. But I would probably say that this was much more funny, and doesn't take itself as seriously with its story either. And it is Way of the Househusband, which I've now got 3 of. Now, when I first started reading this, I actually wasn't too sure if I liked it or not. I think I went into it kind of expecting it to be something that it wasn't. I expected it to have more of a more serious undertone and to have a story that actually progressed as it went on. But it's actually formatted much more like a sketch show, where each chapter is a self-contained little story, I guess. But the more that I read it, the more I was getting into it, and the more I started to understand the characters and their different quirks. and it's really good. Basically, the general idea behind this is that the main character is an ex-Yakuza member, and he broke away from that to start his family, and now lives as a house husband, and his wife has this like high-powered job. So most of the time he stays at home doing all of the jobs and going shopping and stuff. Obviously the twist here though is that because he's an ex-Yakuza member, he often comes across as being overly threatening in different like everyday scenarios, and because of that he ends up getting himself into all sorts of different situations. It's actually really good, and I've been really enjoying this series. So now that we've whittled this side down a little bit, I think we should do some on this side. Not that they're organised in any way, but still, let's make this side a little bit smaller, I guess, and talk about this quite big book, which is 5 centimetres per second. So this one is an interesting one in my collection actually, because this is the only manga that I've got that didn't actually start as a manga. So this is actually adapted from the film of the same name, and I've actually not seen the film, so you'll have to let me know if you've seen it and you think it's any good. But what I can vouch for is that the manga is excellent. So this is a much more realistic manga, I would say. It's one that's focused more so on relationships, being a shoujo manga. And it basically follows this guy as he goes through his like early adult life, I guess, and all of the different relationships he gets himself into. At the start of the book we see him as a kid, and him and this girl meet and end up sort of kind of getting together, but then he has to move schools and moves away. And the rest of the book is kind of about how that relationship affects all of his future relationships. I imagine that this one isn't for everybody, but I've actually been really enjoying this style of manga, and there's a few more here that we're going to be talking about in this same style as well that are actually really good. But yeah, although I wouldn't say that 5 centimetres per second is the best in this style that we're going to be talking about today, it is a darn good one, and I recommend it if you're a fan of this sort of thing. Next up, we're going to be talking about probably one of my favourite series that I've read recently, which is a similar sort of style to 5 centimetres per second, I guess, but I actually preferred this, and it's got 3 volumes as well, and it is The Golden Sheep. And obviously I've got all 3 of them. So The Golden Sheep is sort of similar to 5 centimetres per second in the way that it's more realistic and is about relationships and that sort of thing. But I would say that this is slightly more interesting because there's a lot more characters that get developed a little bit more. It's actually a little bit dark to begin with, featuring like elements of like talking about suicide and stuff like that. With one of the main characters actually attempting suicide at one point. So if that sort of thing is a trigger, I wouldn't recommend that you read this. It is only kind of at the beginning of the story that stuff happens, and it does get much more light-hearted as it goes on. I guess it does talk about some other dark topics as well, but nothing quite as dark as what's featured at the beginning of the story. But yeah, basically the gist of the story with this one is that there's this friendship group, and one of them moves away, like early on in school when they're still quite young kids. And because she moves away, it kind of like breaks the friendship group up a bit. But then eventually, years later, she returns to the town, and she basically attempts to like reform this friendship group, but it obviously turns out that because they're all much older at that point, they've kind of changed as people, and it's about them all sort of dealing with how they've all changed. So yeah, it's pretty good, sort of coming of age story, and I would highly recommend reading it if you think that sounds interesting. Now we might as well talk about another book that's actually written by the same author that wrote The Golden Sheep that we just talked about, and this one I actually read first, and this is what kind of got me into this style of book actually. This is the first one that I read in the sort of shoujo category, and it is The God's Lie. So this one is only 1 volume, so it's a lot shorter than some of the others that we've talked about, but it felt a lot longer than that actually, because it felt like there was a lot happening. And it's a similar sort of thing to The Golden Sheep, I guess, although it doesn't like go like forward or backwards in time or anything like that. It's all just set in like one time frame. And it's basically about the beginnings of this relationship between this young boy and girl. But the girl sort of comes across as a little bit weird because she's really mature for her age. And the reason for that turns out to be that she's sort of left on her own by her dad a lot. So it's about this boy sort of like entering her world and realizing what she has to do on a like daily basis that he normally never needs to think about. So yeah, it's sort of about them growing up a bit and becoming a little bit more mature, but him sort of wanting to protect her from things that she probably shouldn't be having to deal with at her age. But yeah, this is honestly a really good read, and like with these other books, if that does sound interesting, I highly recommend this one. And because it is only one volume and it's like reasonably short as well, it's also quite cheap, so definitely pick it up. Now the next one is one that's still ongoing, and I've currently got 2 volumes of this, and I'm definitely wanting to continue this and pick up the other volumes that are out at the moment as well. And this is an interesting one, because this one is actually published by Square Enix Manga, which I'm pretty sure is like a new publishing company, obviously under Square Enix. So yeah, it doesn't have anything to do with games though. It is a man and his cat. And like I say, I've got 2 volumes of this at the moment. So this series is basically about a man and his cat, who would have thought? Yeah, this man basically feels a bit lonely after his wife has died, and decides that the best way of sort of coping with that is to go out and get a cat. The cat he ends up getting is one that's been in this like shop for like a year or so, and the cat doesn't think it's going to be found by anybody, but then this man comes along and finally adopts him. The interesting thing with this manga though is that not only do we see things from the man's perspective sometimes, but we also get to see things from the cat's perspective as well. And I think that's where a lot of the like funny and just sort of like great moments in this manga come from. You really get to know both the man and the inner thoughts of the cat, and I just think it's a really nice, wholesome manga that has elements of being maybe a little bit sad, because we do get to learn a little bit more about the man's relationship with his wife and sort of like what the cat means to him. But yeah, overall, it's really light-hearted, really fun, loads of funny moments as well, where the cat is just doing really cat-like things. And yeah, if you are an owner of a cat, or you just like cats in general, you're probably sure to like this one, and you'll definitely find it relatable. Now the next one I want to talk about is another one of those ones where I've only got 1 volume, and it didn't quite gel with me. Kind of like Dorohedoro and Zom 100 that we've already talked about. And this one is Ajin, Demi-Human. So when I was looking at like the blurb for this one and quickly like flicking through it, I actually thought that I was really gonna like this, because it appeared to have lots of these horror elements. It looked quite like violent and gory and stuff, and I'm kind of into that sort of thing. But when I started it, it just didn't really grab me all that much. It was maybe a little bit too supernatural, and it sort of became more so about like the powers that this boy has, rather than the more like serious horror elements. But yeah, maybe this is one where if I read more I would be able to get into it, I'm not sure. But yeah, I'm not 100% convinced that this one's for me. The next 2 books I want to talk about, I'm pretty sure I haven't already talked about these in the previous Pixels book club, but I could be wrong on that, but I figured I'd talk about them anyway a little bit here. So these are the 2 Death Note books that I was missing from my collection. So the first one, this one here, is Death Note Short Stories, which actually came out relatively recently. It came out earlier this year. And it's basically just a compilation of several of the short stories that have been released like throughout the series' lifespan. So it kind of like, some of them are set after the main Death Note manga, which is really interesting. It follows like a new user of the Death Note, and the way that he uses the Death Note is just ingenious. and I really liked that story. That's definitely like the selling point of this collection. But yeah, I mean, obviously if you're a fan of Death Note, either the manga or the anime, you should definitely get this. Because so far, none of these stories have actually been translated into the anime format, so the only way of experiencing them is by reading this. The other Death Note book that I got is actually the 13th volume of the original run of Death Note. But this isn't like a normal volume. This one is almost like a behind the scenes volume, so it features like interviews with the artist and the writer. It's got loads of like trivia in it. It does actually have one of the short stories that was later reprinted in the short stories book. That one being like the pilot manga that was written before the main series, which is really interesting to read through because it has like different rules for the Death Note, and an early version of Ryuk is in it who acts a little bit differently and stuff. So yeah, if you are a big fan of Death Note and you kind of want to know more about the universe and stuff, this is really interesting to go through. And it actually took me a long time to read as well, because despite it looking reasonably small, it's actually like printed quite small on the pages, and there's a lot of text, which is unusual for manga, obviously. So yeah, this one is actually more so like a regular book than a manga, to be honest. So before we tackle these 4 beasts of books, which I'm really excited to get into because I think that these are probably some of the best things that I've ever read, not just in this video, but overall out of any book I've ever read, we should probably tackle this side first. So let's start with the one on the top, which is Gyo. Now, I could be absolutely butchering the way that you pronounce this. Maybe it's supposed to be Gyo, but I've been calling it Gyo all this time, and I'm not going to stop now. So this obviously is written by Junji Ito, and this is the first of his books that I've got that's not a collection of short stories. So that was actually pretty interesting, because obviously I'm more so used to his work in the short story department. But reading like a fuller, more developed story was just really cool. What I will say though is that I would say that this isn't particularly scary, and to be honest, I'm not sure that I like really enjoyed it. It was fun to read through, but I feel like as it goes on it maybe gets a little bit too silly for its own good. And to be honest, even the initial premise is reasonably silly, so you can only imagine how silly it gets. So basically, to talk about the introduction of the story here, it's about this person who's really sensitive to smells, and they start smelling this like horrific thing that nobody else can quite smell, and it turns out that it's coming from this fish that is like sort of moving weirdly and is able to move around and breathe on land. And it basically turns into this thing where loads of fish are able to walk on land and start attacking people, but it gets absolutely ridiculous towards the end. If you're a fan of like really surreal, almost darkly funny horror, this is probably really up your alley. So yeah, if that sounds interesting, give it a go. So this next book here is called Solanin, and this was a really good one. This caught my eye mostly because of the art, to be honest. The art in this is just absolutely amazing. It almost has these almost like semi-photorealistic backgrounds at times, and it's mixed with the obviously like sort of semi-traditional manga look. But yeah, this one is really good if you're into that sort of like slice of life, realistic style of manga. Like some of the others we've talked about, this one is sort of about two people's relationship, but there's a twist halfway through the story that actually makes it take quite a dark turn. But initially, this is actually sort of framed as a really wholesome story, where it's about these two people who are in their maybe like early 20s, who have just moved into an apartment and are just like setting up their lives. One of them is really unhappy with the job because they're working really long hours in an office, and they end up leaving it. But then obviously they have to deal with the fact that neither of them have very good jobs, and it's basically just about them living their day-to-day lives. kind of probably making it sound boring, but there's a lot going on that obviously I'm not going to talk about here because it would spoil things. But yeah, really, really good. I enjoyed this one a lot and I would highly recommend it. This next one is actually probably the second best manga that I've read out of any of these. And it's a similar sort of style to Solanin, actually, I guess. But this is just probably done a little bit better. And it is Orange, of which I've got the two kind of like big thick versions. There is also a third book which is called Orange Future, and it's set like a few years after the main story and acts as a sort of like epilogue. But yeah, I've not got that yet. I definitely want to get that at some point though, and no doubt it will probably be featured in the next of these videos. But yeah, the base story of Orange, it's about these people who are in school, and one of them gets a letter from herself 10 years in the future. And the letter explains that there's one of their friends who are like kind of new to the school who is going to end up dying at a certain point in the future. So the letter goes through all of these things that they need to do every day to try and prevent this from happening. But obviously with her doing that, it's going to end up changing the future, so the letter becomes almost less and less accurate as the story goes on. So yeah, really, really interesting plot setup with this. And despite it having like the sort of like time travel-y, like sci-fi element, the story actually doesn't like dwell on that too much, and it's more so just about how the characters interact with each other and their relationships that make this so gripping. And it's also quite a long story as well. Like if you put these together, this is actually quite a thick book, so you can imagine that quite a lot happens. But yeah, out of any of this style of book that I've talked about, these are the ones that I recommend the most. The next book that I'm talking about, there's actually 3 of these, and I've only got the first one at the moment. And the reason that I picked this up is because it actually looked a little bit similar to Junji Ito's work, and I was wanting to read more like horror manga at the time. And this one is The Drifting Classroom. Now, this is actually a slightly older manga, I think, and when you're reading through it, that does become quite apparent. Like the artwork almost looks a little bit old-fashioned, which isn't necessarily off-putting, but I kind of feel like if this was made today, it would probably be executed a little bit better than what it is here. There's some moments that, like, in theory should be really, like, shocking and graphic, and maybe a little bit violent, but that doesn't really come across all too much, because of the way that the artwork is a little bit older. Having said that though, the thing that is really good about this book is the story, because it's about this group of kids, I guess, and they go to school one day. The main character has just had an argument with his mum and just like runs off to go to school. But upon reaching the school, it just disappears out of nowhere. So everybody is like trying to explain it. There's just this crater in the floor and nobody knows what's happened. But for most of the book, we actually see it from the perspective of the kids in the school, and we see where the school has gone, and it's just in the middle of this weird desert. So yeah, at that point it becomes this like survival story where obviously they've got a limited amount of food, a limited amount of water and supplies and stuff like that. The teachers all start going a little bit crazy because they don't know what to do. And there's like hundreds of kids in this school that need looking after as well. So yeah, obviously at certain points they end up going into the desert, and yeah, I won't ruin what happens when they do that. But yeah, the story is really good, and I do want to see how it ends by getting the second and third ones of these. So before we wrap up this video and talk about these 4 massive books right here, I want to sidetrack myself a little bit and talk about these 2 books, which aren't actually manga, they're just traditional graphic novels. But I still think that you would like them, so I figured I would include them in this video, and they are The Sad Ghost Club 1 and 2. So these are just really wholesome books. They're basically about these characters who are really like introverted and anxious about social situations. But the way that it presents these characters is as ghosts, but they're just like people wearing sheets over their head, like they're wearing like a really rubbish Halloween costume. And obviously that's symbolic of them wanting to hide away from people and stuff like that. But it's a really, really good story, really, really nice and wholesome, like I say. But the thing that I really liked about these is its almost realistic interpretation of what it's like to deal with anxiety. And yeah, it's just really, really great. If you yourself struggle with that sort of thing, I think that you would really be interested in reading these. So we're finally here talking about these 4 massive books that I've sort of been building up to throughout this video. And a lot of you probably already know what these are, because this is probably one of the most influential mangas ever written. So yeah, you'll probably recognize it. But it is the deluxe volumes of, I can't move it because it's so heavy, of Berserk. There we go. So yeah, I've never read Berserk before, but I've obviously heard a lot about it. It was a long time ago, but I have actually watched the 3 Golden Age films, but I really didn't remember them all too well because it was years and years ago that I watched those. So yeah, buying these, it's been really my introduction to the Berserk universe. Like I said before in the video, honestly, this is probably the single best thing that I've ever read. Not even just with manga, but out of anything. The story is just absolutely incredible. The characters are just like amazing. And I don't even know what to say because there's so much to talk about here. But yeah, for those of you who might not know what Berserk is, it's kind of difficult to describe because it kind of goes all over the place with its story, but to sum it up really quickly, it's basically about this guy called Guts, who's this sort of mercenary who's like well known for being almost unbeatable, and he basically travels around the world killing monsters, and he's on a quest to sort of like find someone or something. But the reason that he's looking for this particular thing or person isn't immediately apparent. But yeah, as it goes on, obviously you learn more about what he's looking for and the reasons that he's looking for it. So obviously, as you can see, I've got 4 of these big hardcover versions, and these 4 actually cover the first arc, which is the Black Swordsman arc. That ends actually about halfway through, well, actually probably a little bit more than halfway through the first hardcover book, and then the rest of them are the second arc, which is the Golden Age arc, which actually finishes about halfway through the 5th deluxe version, I think. So I've not actually finished it yet. But yeah, the Black Swordsman arc is basically just setting up the universe, and then the Golden Age arc goes back in time to when Guts was a kid, and sort of like explains more about his history and the overarching story of the Berserk universe. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to ending the Golden Age arc and then continuing on Guts' story from there. Not only is the story absolutely incredible though, but the artwork is also incredible to match. Like seriously, this art is probably the best that I've ever seen in any of this manga. It's just absolutely incredible. And if you're a fan of like dark fantasy, or if you're a fan of the games made by From Software, like Demon Souls, Dark Souls and Bloodborne, you're probably pretty much guaranteed to love this, because Berserk was actually really influential with the tone of those games. So yeah, definitely check this out if you're at all interested in anything that I've been saying. What I will say though is that Berserk is an extremely adult series. Basically, like, every trigger warning that exists needs to be put up there for this. There's like ultra violent scenes and just some really graphic stuff. So if that is disturbing to you in any way, probably get away from this. It's probably not for you. But for anybody that's into that and into like horror elements, this is one of the best. Check it out. But there we have it. That is all of the manga that I've been picking up and reading over the last few months. When you actually put it all into stacks like this, it actually looks like I've got a lot, which is weird because it didn't feel like I actually had that much to talk about, but actually seeing it in front of you is a different story. I'm pretty happy with the variety of stuff that I've been reading as well, not only with like the darker, like more horror things like Berserk, but also the more like relaxed stuff about like normal life, I guess. I've been really enjoying like both sides of the manga world in that way, and I can't wait to read more. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and leave a comment down below letting me know if you're interested in reading any of these, and if you've got any recommendations for me based on any of this stuff as well, because I'm always interested to learn of new manga that I've never heard about. And, as always, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!